Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by my co-host, Terry Robinson, and today we are going to give you another episode of Tomes of Magic. Mage fans are familiar with the expression that the magic is not in the tools, it's in the mage. But Terry and I are here today to tell you that no, it is in the tools. And we know because we just finished Forged by Dragon's Fire. Before we get into it, Terry, were there any announcements today?
I have two announcements. One, I recently took a road trip, which involved going across the upper Midwest and High Plains states, and I got to stop by Noble Knight Games, who is a well-known distributor of RPG goods, and I mentioned that I had a podcast and no one had ever heard of it, which is usually the response, even though these are like RPG and gaming people, but they seemed to sense that I was fascinated by their operation, and I got a tour of Noble Knight Games, and that was just super nice of the front desk people, and I got to see their whole warehousing facility, and it was really interesting, and I may do a special little side episode explaining how they do their inventorying, because of people in the RPG world that would be interested in encumbrance rules, I think mage players may be up there. So thank you to Noble Knight Games, that was super fun. The other thing is thanks to Alex Malkavian, who was inspired by our show on transmissions from the Rogue Cabal, who did a write-up of the Thule Society for the White Wolf wiki, and they even included footnotes and links to other things. That makes my shriveled heart grow 3 sizes whenever someone adds to the White Wolf wiki. So Alex, thank you for doing that. If you have added a page to the unofficial White Wolf wiki at whitewolf.wikia.com or whitewolf.fandom.com, send us a note about that, and I will give you a thank you on the show. And that's everything for me.
All right. Well, this book is called Forged by Dragon's Fire. It's part of Revised Edition. We're getting towards the end of that edition, the end of its book run. It was put out in 2003. There are 93 pages. There are 3 authors, Craig Blackwelder, Leonard Gentile, John Sneed, and this book covers every kind of wonder that you can expect to come across while playing Mage Revised Edition. It says that it focuses on mystic wonders rather than technological wonders because we have Technomancer's Toy Box towards the end of 2nd edition. They felt like it was time to balance things out a bit. But we do find every sort in this book. I was looking for a talisman or artifact microphone that would make a announcer's voice more deep and resonant and would increase audience interaction with the podcast. Didn't really see it in this book, but if we ever come across something like that, rest assured, Mage the Podcast, we would never use a microphone like that on our listeners. Right, Terry?
That's great. If we get to Victorian Mage, I think we should have like an old-timey one and be like, Adam and Terry talk about Mage, and the other 23 Skidoo coming to you. And now for intro music. So, but no, we wouldn't do that. That would be well below us. Also not within our budget, probably.
Yeah, probably that too. Okay, well, we start off with the prologue. Terry, can you give us a rundown?
The prologue is one of the most early 2000s, late 90s things I've ever seen, and it was amazing. It is entitled After Hours, and it is a long story of cool-ass mage called Zaro Blank breaking into a magical keep things place, looking through all the cool things they're going to need to steal to single-handedly win the Ascension War, including the sphere of mess up the other guy real seriously, until a Hermetic appears and goes, Stop that right now. You're doing it wrong. I'm a Hermetic, and even I've updated my methods. Don't be weird. And then Zaro gets teleported away. I think my favorite part about this are the 2 parts. One, the idea that Zaro is too late for the hot portion of the Ascension War, which I just kind of like as an idea. It doesn't need to be true, but the fact that it is something that characters argue about in universe, I think is a really neat idea. The other is they introduce the Maggot Revolver, which, if you're a fan of Wraith the Oblivion, is a passion-powered item that fires little maggot bolts into another person that burrows into their skin and causes all sorts of damage to a Wraith's corpus. The character is told to make their own wonders and that they should make something that resonates with the times. And I like that as an idea.
I really enjoyed this prologue. I see from the credits it was written by Craig Blackwelder, and one of the things that I have come to enjoy about Craig Blackwelder's work in Revised Edition is He marches to his own drum. He knows what the Sacred Cows of Revised Edition are, but he says, well, I'm just going to do my own thing anyways. In this, we have an example of a hot young mage who's going to change the world, but he's not thinking things through all the way. He meets an older mage who is not a terrible, terrible person, but who basically says, look, if you take this, you're going to kill yourself or some other innocent person on accident, and I'm just not going to have that happen. And instead of being harsh and nasty, I'm just going to give you something good to read. I'm going to send you home, and you'll be able to think things over without killing anybody. I thought it was a fun story to read, and I thought it was well written, and I like how there's a little bit of rebellion even in Revised Edition.
The introduction is called Arts and Crafts, and it raises some basic questions of what a wonder is, which is the blanket term for kind of any magically invested item. It asks a vital question, and it gets to the heart of Mage very quickly, where it says, how do you fit magic items into a game where wizards don't need wands or spells? And I had never thought of that very obvious framing, which is the reason why I don't get paid for this show. And it gives you the idea of sometimes a wonder will allow you to do something that might induce paradox otherwise, but by doing it through a device, it will be less obvious. In addition to that, it talks about how it may make sense paradigmatically, and also that wonders can bring a lot of things to the party in terms of handling paradox and dealing with the side effects of it. And it goes through a bunch of additional paradox handling methodologies, and it is a wide list. And it talks about paradox absorbing devices that can absorb any generated paradox, even if it wasn't from the item, but paradox can't be transferred to it, so it's not like a paradox battery. We have paradox mitigating, which sleepers may not find it vulgar. And it introduces the idea that a item can knock something down from vulgar with witnesses to vulgar without witnesses when sleepers see it happen. It talks about paradox accruing items, where the ST keeps track of the amount of paradox the player doesn't know, and it causes a backlash once the item is filled. Paradox absorbing, that when it's overloaded with paradox, it shatters and stops working. In other cases, if an item generates too much paradox, it may explode in a giant backlash. Paradox randomizing goes to a random person nearby, so marauder.wonder. And then paradox scattering. Once it overloads, it goes to all the people nearby, which may be perfectly fine if you have a lot of friends nearby. It also introduces the idea that wonders can very quickly shed paradox if they are left at a node. That is 1 point per day at a node, or 1 point per month otherwise, which otherwise in Revised we have the idea that characters can shed paradox at the rate of 1 point per week.
I certainly agree with the idea they made in the introduction, and that is, for the majority of regular people, sleepers, an object doing an amazing thing is a lot easier to handle than a person doing an amazing thing. That point was very well made, and when I was reading that, I was thinking of, there's a real magazine out of a company in California called Make Magazine, and it's basically technology projects that you can do at home. They tell you which circuit boards and electronical parts to buy, and they have a guide for how to put it together, how you can make variations on that. And so, for years I've subscribed to it and built a couple of the projects as I had time. And there are some things in there that come close to causing paradox in the real world. For example, there was one item that you could actually build a very small electronic object, and then you could hide it anywhere in a room. And if it was close to an actual radio, something that was actually getting broadcast radio stations, you could set a timer or have a remote button. And when you clicked it, it would override a station with whatever you recorded on the device, and it would play it out of the speakers of the radio. So it could actually override a radio station, but only at a very short range and only one station. And so you could basically mess with people's head. You could have the DJ suddenly say something crazy and outrageous, and then it goes back to the regular broadcast, and it just stuns people. And there are other objects like that you can actually build yourself. And so, yeah, if you say some person saying, "Aha, I used my mind powers," it's like, no way, shut up. But having an object that you stuffed in the cupboard next to the radio, people are like, oh yeah, I totally accept that. So, the old idea of Zeus throwing thunderbolts, well, that's clearly, divine stuff, but you can just have a little object with a wire going into your shirt, and you can cast lightning bolts yourself these days. So the point was very well made. It really gave me pause for thought.
The first type of item that is gone over in detail are artifacts and inventions. And these are items that do not bring their own arete to the party. They are often everyday items that are enchanted to do more. They may have a rote and a focus bundled into one. They list a whole bunch of material correspondences that different traditions would use when crafting such items. It also mentions the idea that there are items called trinkets, which have permanent enchantments on them, which require twice as many successes. One of my favorite parts is it goes through ingredients in a lot of cases. And for the Dream Speakers, one of the ingredients they list are drums, which suggests that you need to like grind up a bunch of drums into a fine powder to create a wonder. But it kind of gives you a bunch that are tied to various paradigms. It also introduces one of my favorite items, which is the none of the above sidebar, which makes mention to the fact that the world of darkness is full of weird stuff that otherwise doesn't fit neatly into categories, and don't hesitate to bring things that don't tie neatly to what we have here. I 75% like this. I am perfectly fine with a storyteller introducing an item that doesn't fit within the mold of sphere magic. One of the problems I have with mage is once you look at the world through a mage lens, you tend to force everything through the lens of the spheres, and anything that doesn't fit neatly into those can kind of get left by the wayside, and a lot of the world of darkness does not fit neatly into those spheres. But we run into a problem if a character wants to create it. How do we figure out what needs to go into it if it doesn't tie to the sphere system? And that is a question I don't feel that the book does a good job of answering. It mentions that if you want to create one of these items, it generally breaks down into 3 steps. Crafting, where you gather materials, make sure you have the appropriate quintessence, make sure that you have a basic vessel to hold the magic. Purification, where you set up the enchantment, and then quickening, where you do the actual enchanting. It indicates that this is going to be a vulgar prime effect, which to me suggests that if it's vulgar, it's going to be prime 4 plus either 4 or 5, depending on whether or not there are witnesses. It strongly recommends that you do this within a sanctum, but still you're repeatedly rolling at difficulty 8 or 9. Your chances of botching actually get quite high in many of these cases, depending on how you want to do things.
I like the flaw system they introduced, the 1, 2, and 3 point flaws. I like the idea of getting a sense of scale for the flaw you want to introduce and then putting it on the item and then adding some interest to that and affecting its cost to the player, whether it's background points or experience. I thought that was nice. It is certainly a long, difficult process to make artifacts and inventions, and in fact, a lot of other wonders in this book. And while it does make the wonders special, and it does kind of make it an interesting part of the chronicle you're running, it can also serve to make them very rare. It seems to set a very high barrier. One of the ideas in this book is the player, when they want to spend their experience points and get an artifact, they shouldn't just spend the points and say, okay, now I got it. They should actually go on a mission to find just the right materials, and then they need to make a number of sphere rolls and skill rolls and all these other things. And it can make it an interesting part of the chronicle, but at the same time it raises the bar very high. In fact, I wonder if there are a lot of players who are going to hear all the things that they have to do in addition to spending experience and just say, you know what, changed my mind, it's not worth it. Also, this does seem to quietly favor the storytellers who don't want artifacts and inventions in their game. It's like, oh, you want one? Well, you got to do all this. Huh? How about that? You still want it? You still excited about that? So it makes it very easy for a storyteller to just push wonders out of their game. It raises such a high bar. But for a favorite item, I really liked Professor Gunderly's ether tracking Clockwork Wonder Globe. Nice how a wonder has wonder right in the name. This is basically a large ornate globe that a mage keeps in his sanctum. He does not let anyone else see it or know that he has it. He's trying to keep it very, very quiet. It shows, as most globes, the planet Earth. But the difference is you can see different marks, lights glimmering and stuff like that, to see where are all of the nodes, where are all of the cairns for werewolves, and other places like that. If I was going to put it into a game, though, I would make it a little less specific and a little less powerful, because as it's written up here, it is so accurate and so detailed and covers the entire planet without error. I think that's too much information. I think it's unbalancing for a chronicle. I think letting a player see it even once and then not letting them see it again, I think it's still unbalanced a chronicle. It's like putting everything on the table for all the factions of the world of darkness at once. So I would tone it down a bit, but I really like the idea.
I had the exact same response where it's like, oh, wow, this is plot device. And the only thing as potent as this is Maynard from the original NWO book, back when it's like, yep, they got satellites that can nuke people from order and detect any accumulation of quintessence larger than a pencil eraser. And you're like, okay, good to know. I think my favorite one that was listed here was Cauldron of Spies, which is a cauldron that a bunch of bats come out of, and they could spy on people for up to 12 hours and then come back. Why do I like that? Because it is a thing you see that is flavorful, where someone is stirring a pot and bats fly out, and every time someone did it, as per what we do in the shadows, I would probably yell "bat," and I give a lot of points to things like that.
One thing that I noticed about that wonder that made me really like it was it said that bats or owls or ravens or something else, some small thing that flies in large numbers, it will go out and it will spy for the mage, and it will instantly zap the information back. And then when it's done, it will either fade away or just fly off into the sunset. It does not return to the mage. And I was thinking that makes it work as a mage class wonder. I would think that a sorcerer class magic item would require the creatures to fly back to the sorcerer and report their information, and the weakness of that is they can be tracked by an enemy. And so that fit for me. I liked that.
The next class of items it talks about are charms, which are one-shot effects. They are, you make the roll to create them in a batch. They are usable by non-mages. They can last for a certain period of time based on how many extra successes that you decide to put into them, but a minimum of 3 months. I thought it was kind of an FU to players that use them, that it made the statement that, like, you cannot create charms during downtime. And I'm like, that's the entire point of making charms, is you get to do it during your downtime. So periodically in this book, it'll make mention of, like, characters can't do this off screen. It's like, what's the point then? I have to, objectively, the greatest charm of all times are unbullets. Arguably, the only greater charm is nukes, which are introduced as charms in Fallen Tower, Las Vegas, which I like because, as it clearly mentions here, charms are made in batches, so you can't make just one nuke. It also suggests that when you make a charm, you make 2 to 12 of them, and that sounds like somebody is like, yeah, you make 2d6. A lot of the rules in here are suspiciously close to the Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rules for making magical items, but unbullets were my favorite. They are bullets with a powerful life and entropy effect on them. When you shoot someone, they are healed. And I try and always have my characters gain eventual access to unbullets for the sheer fun that they can introduce into any game.
When looking at the charms and gadgets section, it does mention that these can have a big effect on your stories, and so storytellers need to keep very careful track of all of the charms that all of the players have and what they're going to do, and when they get spent, you got to mark them off on a list, and this is important. And in spirit, I agree, but in practice, I would say, look, charms, taking care of the charms should fall on the players. Storytellers and players should have a certain level of trust between them when running a game, and you should just say to the players, look, you have all these charms to do all these things. Okay, look, here's an extra piece of paper. Mark them down. As you use them, mark them off. This is how we do it in my game. You're going to keep track of this for me. I don't want the headache. Don't let charms complicate your game. They should make it more fun. When it comes to a favorite item, I liked the Ebon Candles of Manifest Negrescence, and I probably butchered that, but so be it. This is supposed to be charms that are created by Hollow Ones, and they are basically big fat black candles. And when you light one, it helps with security for your sanctum or low-level Hollow One chantry. And that is when they are burning, they set off this something kind of like a fog or a mist in the area where it's hard to see if you're not the person who made it or a member of their cabal. It's actually hard to breathe. It's hard to hear. It just makes this kind of spooky ambience where an intruder walks in and it's like, wait, I'm having trouble breathing. I can't hear very well. There's a funny smell that blocks out my ability to smell anything else. I can't see straight. I'm getting disoriented, perhaps dizziness. And I thought that was a cool charm that would be fun to use in a game. It's easy to add little complications to that based on resonance, so that you can say, every candle's unique, or every batch from a different creator is going to be unique. So I would have fun with that as a storyteller.
The thing about it is it mentions like, oh, this helped with sneaky technocrats. And I thought it was going to be a fog that allowed you to sneak into other places. And then it's like, no, it's a thick fog that will kill children. And you're like, oh, okay. Um, and you're like, that's much more metal than I anticipated. The next section it goes over in detail are fetishes, which are cases where a spirit is bound into an object, either through chiminage or through spirit form. When you say, get back in your room, and the spirit goes, no. And you go, yes. And the spirit goes, okay. It mentions that for techno-magical items that a spirit wants it to be in something sleek and stylish, and that they have a fondness for Art Deco. Younger spirits don't mind being bound as much, and the virtual adepts are slowly becoming adept at this. It mentions that a lot of the weird dream speaker behaviors may be due to bans and requirements of spirits bound into fetishes they own. It mentions rules on how to shove a spirit into things, what it takes to get multiple spirits into it. This is an interesting, I'm not going to quite say change, but in an earlier book it made mention that the two things that you needed to create a fetish are a spirit that is willing to be bound into an object, as well as a spirit that has a particular charm that could be used, and that fetishes are just essentially a way of for mages to make charms, to gain access to spirit charms. Here it kind of loosens up on that. It also gives some recommended rules on what a spirit will be requiring, and then we get a bunch of example items. It also mentions that one of the requirements for a fetish is that the item containing the spirit must be made by the mage. And for the Informa-Vision, which is a spirit thing that accumulates information, it's hard because few people can make their own computers. And I'm like, that's an interesting rule to require, that the mage has to make the totality of it. I feel like that could be somewhat hard to adjudicate. One of my favorite ones here was the Vengeance Blade. Normally, I'm not that into combat weapons, but it mentions that the character gets, against a particular target, -2 to hit, +2 to damage, and that it shatters once their target is done. I like this because I could very much see a character getting or making one of these, and since it is a fetish, it does contain a somewhat intelligent spirit, and I very much like the idea of a character needing to talk through their need for vengeance with the thing that is going to be the implement of that vengeance. What happens if the character changes their mind, or their initial goal of merely wounding or stealing back something turns into murder because the item that they've created, the spirit of vengeance that they've bound, goads them into it. Or alternatively, the other way around, where it is a spirit of justice instead, and the character is not acting justly and simply is out for simple vengeance. We also get some information on binding angels. They mention that there's only one of any given angel to be bound, and that's an interesting way of thinking maybe about astral entities versus mid-umbral entities, where any number of people can bind the spirit of Ox or what have you to an item that enhances their stats. And it mentions that Porthos did a lot of binding, and that there is often a quest, as it were, to find an angel bound into a particular item so that you can get it to do whatever you need it to do, and that choristers in general are opposed to this, which I think makes sense.
Yeah, that actually came up in a game that I was running online a few years back. There was a hermetic character who was coming to a chorister character, player characters in the game, and he was saying, "Hey, I've got this angel binding right. Let's do this thing, and we'll stop the bad guys." And the chorister said, "No, that's not the way you should treat angels." And the hermetic's like, "No, look, we got a bad guy here. We got a problem. Can we just solve the problem?" The chorister's like, "No, we can't. That's no way to treat an angel." And it's like, it was so fun to see that discussion come up right during the game. But getting back to the point, which I should probably do, talking about fetishes, on page 33, there's a note about if you coerce the fetishes, then the group they belong to are all going to get upset, and you shouldn't do that, and mages who do that get into trouble quickly. I was thinking this applies really well for middle umbra spirits, but when talking about high umbra spirits, I would say not necessarily. I'd say there's probably a good number of loner spirits there, and it would probably be a different dynamic. There is a sidebar, trouble with the changing breed, saying if a mage carries a fetish, then he meets a were creature like a werewolf or a werecat, then that were creature is going to get terribly offended, and there could be a fight or there could be trouble over that. This plays into the revised edition stance on relations between mages and were creatures. And so for revised edition, this is very appropriate. But I just wanted to say that for the first two edition of mages, it's not necessarily the case. You could have a dream speaker carrying a fetish who meets a werewolf, and the werewolf affords them more respect. It's like, "Oh, I've got a fetish, you've got one too. I didn't know humans could do that. I see you better than I did before." So that sidebar really just applies to Revised Edition. This idea about fetishes being more effective in the Umbra was rather interesting to me. I guess that should probably be a no-brainer, but it kind of sparked my interest. I hadn't thought it through too seriously in the past. It's nice that this comes out after Infinite Tapestry because, now in Revised Edition, mages can get into the Umbra more easily. But a fetish, because it houses a spirit from the Umbra and it's, in a sense, back home, then it might be a little more powerful or do things a little more easily or a little more impressive to other people that you meet as it does its thing. That was kind of a cool idea. As for a favorite item in here, favorite fetish, the Lens of Zadkiel, I thought was very interesting. It's basically an object that houses an angelic spirit, and the user can use the angel's aid to see through illusions and see the truth behind things. And I thought this was very interesting because the angelic spirit is basically filtering things for the user. So a storyteller could say, instead of seeing what's really going on when you use the fetish, you are instead seeing things from an angel's point of view. And so as the user continues to use it in an ongoing chronicle, they're going to be brought around to the point of view of this group of angels more and more. There's going to be more of a connection to them. The way the angels see things will become natural for the user. And of course, in your game, it might be an actual angel, or it might just be a high-embroid spirit that manifests what it thinks humans expect an angel to be like. That's something you can work out. But I just thought that was very interesting, this item that slowly brings a mage around to an Umbrid spirit's point of view.
The next section that it brings up is Periapts. These are items that are created to store quintessence. The mystical version is a Periapt. A technomantic version of that is a matrix. You don't quite need to be in direct contact just to grab the quintessence for it, but it gives you the first gimme rule of you kind of need to be close enough, which I appreciate. Sometimes the rules are too like, no, if it doesn't touch bare skin, you don't get the benefit of it. It is a very task-intensive process to create one. You need at least 10 pawns of tasks per point of the wonder background that you want to create the Periapt, which ultimately stores 5 or 10 points. It brought up to me one of the things in here is the book repeatedly refers to specifically needing tasks in a lot of cases versus simple quintessence. I'm not quite sure why that is necessarily the case, why you just can't have enough quintessence to make it, but that is one of the requirements. What's your thought, Adam?
Well, as I was reading those sections, my impression, and I can't back this up, but my impression is that the book said when you're making a wonder, you need to have quintessence that has a certain resonance. And so when a mage takes tasks and converts it to quintessence and brings it into their own body, it gets affected by the mage's resonance. And so I think tasks can keep a more pure resonance of a certain type without it mingling with the mage's own resonance. And I think that's why they were strict about it. But again, that's just my impression.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. So it's more about it being a embodied form of resonance than it being an embodied form of quintessence necessarily.
Could be.
My favorite was the hydrogen battery. It just explains how all the technocratic devices work. Where it's just like, yep, there's batteries and everything. It brings up questions of quintessence infrastructure. You need matter 5 to do it, which suggests that batteries and bulletproof cladding, that all the matter masters in the technocracy are constantly just like whipping that stuff out, which seems awfully time consuming. So it just kind of explains, yep, this is how their devices work so well for so long.
There was one point in this section where it was talking about how to take quintessence out of victims, basically, for getting them into periapts or for doing certain things. And like I've said in the past, you really want to be careful with pulling quintessence out of people, because if you make it easy enough, then you're going to turn mages into a kind of psychic vampire or something, and then you start like really getting into vampire territory, which is a big part of the World of Darkness. So something to watch. One of the things I appreciated about the Prime Sphere write-up in the initial, first edition core book was it said if you want to take a regular human being, a sleeper, and pull quintessence out of their body, it takes high-level magic, it's a long, gruesome prospect, and you get very little quintessence out of it. So it's basically, you can do it, but it's not worth it. So that's why mages don't do it much. It's like, oh, this fits. I get this. I thought the resonance rules for Periapt creation were too strict. I also thought requiring matter 5 or life 5 for creating a Periapt was just too strict for me. I thought, look, Periapt, like a 1 or 2 point Periapt, this is a pretty low-level magic item, a low-level wonder as far as wonders go. And so I really don't think it's unreasonable for a low-level mage to make something like that themselves. So to say only a master can make a Periapt, it just didn't seem appropriate to me. I would probably, if I was going to be a little more strict about it, I would say maybe Prime 3, Matter 2, or perhaps Life 2 to make one, and you can't make a Periapt that has a higher level than the creator's Arete. I think that might be something I would use instead. And for a favorite Periapt, I also chose the Temple of the Theoi Chthon. I thought that was very flavorful. I was reading through this section, and there's all these Periapts like, yeah, that's useful, but it doesn't really grab me. And then you get to the end, and you have this big, spooky building with its own arcane. It like disappears. You've heard rumors about it, but you can't find it. Then one day you find it, and it's full of quintessence, and you can do all this cool stuff with it. And then you leave, and you say, man, I'm gonna use that again. This is gonna be on my new base of operations, and you can't find it. And you tell other people about it. Yeah, I've heard those rumors. I don't believe you. So yeah. I thought that was fun. It can be a lot of fun when you finally stumble across it, and there's a lower chance that players are going to abuse it. So a lot of fun with that one.
The next section goes over talisman and devices. And this section answers a vital question that we had from previous editions that said, if this costs a point of willpower to make, as in quite literally previously when you were done creating a talisman or a device, you lost a point of willpower that went into the device. You could get it back if you ever destroyed the device. Why would you go through this process? And the answer it gives you is a couple. One is it proves your skill. Having a amazing talisman or an amazing device shows to other people your prowess and ability. And I'm like, yeah, mages are jerks a lot of the time, and they're really jockeying for position. I could see sacrificing a point of willpower to look really cool. The talisman is an extension of the self. It is relatively easy to get the item back if it is stolen from you, but it also represents a mystic link to the person who created it. So magic cast through the talisman may affect its creator. They can act on their own sometimes. They allow you to sidestep the limit of one effect per turn, because the talisman does not count against the character's single action, which makes the talisman go from meh to whoa. And I'm like, what if you're firing multiple magic guns? And then the book is like, you could even fire multiple magic guns without having to split your dice pool. And I'm like, well, son of a gun, Mr. Blackwelder. You knew what I was thinking. And that is, if true, redunculous if you allow that. It can store paradox even if the talisman did not do the effect, so a talisman can store paradox not tied to the effect it generated. It sheds paradox remarkably quickly. They are capable of paradox nullification, where they just kind of eat paradox as time goes on, and they are highly tied to the creator. As far as making one, they often become a focus. We get no rules on how to change focuses after the fact that I know of. The core book says that you can get past a personal focus by relearning the sphere, but based on the text of this book, I don't believe that is what it is talking about. To me, it seems to be one of those cases that if you make a talisman, you can, as part of the creation process, make it one of your focuses. It also mentions that using one gives you a -1, and I'm not quite sure why. Is it saying that it is a unique focus, or that it is so heavily personalized that it gives some sort of benefit, or is it just saying that you're using it when you probably don't need a focus? Otherwise, I thought the rules there were a little ambiguous. It mentions that you can figure out who the owner of a talisman is with a simple life 1 effect. It introduces the idea of side effects, which are things that are annoying but reduce the difficulty of using it by 1, and that also at creation, a talisman will consume a point of resonance.
I like the possibilities opened by aware talismans, but I like the idea of keeping the regular talismans from previous editions that have no link to the creator. So I think my approach to that would probably be a talisman that does not require a permanent point of willpower from the creator, but it would take twice as long to make or require more tasks or some combination like that. So I like to keep that door open. This section reminds me how complicated resonance can get if you let it, talking about how keeping careful track of this resonance and that resonance and how they affect each other and keep a record sheet handy all the time. It's like, oh, well, okay, you can take that approach, but I would just say it doesn't necessarily have to get that complicated. I might tone that aspect down a bit. It talks about technomagical devices, but nowhere in this book does it state that technomagical devices do not require 1 point of permanent willpower to create, and this was specifically stated in Technomancer's Toy Box. So this is in keeping with the revised edition idea that technomagic and mystic magic are closer together. They're done the same way and have the same requirements, which can be nice. For example, second edition said that technomancers take longer to get rid of their foci, but they have more convenient foci, whereas revised edition said, look, everybody gets rid of their foci at the same rate, whether they're a techno mage or a mystic mage. That kind of fit, but then you have to wonder, how does the technocracy have so many devices with a capital D if every single one of them takes a permanent point of willpower? That was something this book should have addressed, at least in a sidebar, and it did not. And so, yeah, I kind of stand with Terry on that one. There were some things this book should have addressed and just didn't.
It does create an interesting thing of the entire team was lost to the Void Thing from beyond space. I'm truly sorry for their loss. Did you get their light environment suits? Wait, what? Yeah, those things are very expensive to make. I recognize your entire family is dead, but did you get their spacesuits? No. Oh, this is truly a terrible loss.
Yeah, if every spacesuit that the Void Engineers is using takes some mages 1 permanent point of willpower to make, then holy cow, there's not going to be many spacesuits. They're going to be more valuable than the recruits.
Yeah.
This is something to think about. We need to think about some aspects of our setting here.
Or all the Void Engineers are perfectly are very interested in seeing your presentation on buying a timeshare and other things that I assume happen at low willpower.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to a favorite talisman from this section, I liked the Rod of Holy Cleansing. That was a chorister talisman that is basically like a rod or something like a wand that uses a prime effect where you point it at something or touch something with it, and it mystically lights on fire and then slowly disintegrates until it is gone. And it even states that choristers can use this on attacking technocrats so that it will damage or completely destroy the technocrats' equipment, but not the technocrats themselves. So it's like, haha, I took away your magic gun and your sensor device and your, the implant in your head that helps you communicate with base. So you want a fist fight, or are you just going to go home now? So I thought that was pretty cool. And also another technomagical device in here that grabbed my attention was the Transport Pass card. It was a technocracy device. And I thought that was really cool because it says every time you use it, you find a convenient and inexpensive way to travel from one place to another in the regular world, not in the Umbra. This is going to always be something unusual and unexpected. For example, you're at an airport and it's like, well, I just want a plane ticket to go somewhere right now, so I'm going to pull out my Transport Pass card and use it. And the player is expecting they're just going to get in line at one of the gates and get onto a regular plane like everybody else. And then the storyteller says, oh no, some nut job walks up and says, hey, I've got a private small jet out here and I'm flying from here to here. You want to come with me? And it's like, oh, I was not expecting this one. And then halfway he's got to stop for fuel and you get onto a military transport with a bunch of Marines who are shouting gung-ho phrases back and forth to each other, and you've got to just sit there quietly. It's like, look, I just need to get there. Just keep your mouth shut. So a lot of fun possibilities like that.
It does specifically say that the method used is unusually comfortable. So at least while you're being shouted by Marines, you probably have one of those really nice massage chairs, at least.
Yeah, I was thinking that because it specifically said at one point, you're going to get on a military transport. It's like, I've seen those. They're not comfortable, but yet this is very comfortable. So I guess you sit next to the pilot or something? It's like, here, take the co-pilot seat. Just don't touch anything. I don't know. Yeah. But still, yeah. Just a lot of fun possibilities in there because it invites the storyteller to think of some unusual way of getting a player character from point A to point B. And so I think it's just going to be fun to use in games.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things that's super cool, but it dies a death on the altar of Correspondence 3. Where it's just like, why go through this when there's that other thing? It's kind of like the discussion of any Star Trek episode where it's like, oh, we need to collect this rare item from these people. And you're like, why aren't we just teleporting it up? And it's just like, oh no, there's an anti-teleportation field. There's always an anti-teleportation field. My favorite item was the fairy cap. It is a 6-point wonder that makes you invincible to environmental effects, and there's a better version that keeps you well fed. And I just like the idea of like somebody in this bulky Allenson hardsuit that has the environmental survival packs loaded onto it, and it's a guy literally with a red felt hat that's completely fine in space. That's mage to me. That's mage right there. It even says if you lose your hat, you have a turn to get it back before you get crushed by the ocean or get lit on fire or something like that. I've always had the conversation with players that are like, so what counts as environmental if you're in a really rough neighborhood? Is gunfire considered environmental? And I'm like, that's an interesting question, especially because like within the world of Changeling, I know no mention of fairy caps, and I just like the idea of a character encountering a Changeling and being like, I have a fairy cap. They're like, wait, what the heck is that? They're like, it's a hat that makes you invincible to the environment. They're like, we have nothing like that. You're like, oh, okay. What did I get this from then? It's like, oh, it's made out of fairies. Uh-oh. One of the things though that I'm going to cheat, and I was very ambivalent about I felt strongly two different ways, were the mental enhancement glasses, because they gave you merits. And nowhere did it give a system for how to make an item that gives a merit. So I guess it's implicitly one of those things a player and a storyteller would need to work out. I really like the idea of talismans and devices that grant backgrounds and so on, but we get no system on how to do that. And I just kind of felt like the book kind of fell down on that account.
I can see your point about a talisman in this case that grants merits. And how would you come up with a system for that? I that's a valid point, but at the same time, I would probably look at that specific talisman in this book and use it as a guideline. It's like, okay, how many merits? What is the total number of points that those merits are worth? And what is the total number of points? I mean, what is the point value of this talisman? Okay, that gives me a rough guideline, and I guess I'll work it out from here. And if I think it's like ridiculous, like too many merits for too low a value of the talisman, then I'd probably ratchet it up a bit and then have that as a new adjusted guideline. So I can see that's a valid point. However, it's not necessarily a showstopper for me.
The next section we get are Grimoires and Principiae. These are books or other similar media items that can guide a mage through either learning spheres or advancing their arete. They are rooted in paradigm, and they may teach things without requiring seeking. They also grant easier access to advancement, as in the value of the Grimoire or Principiae cuts that many points off of the amount of XP required to advance. This is a mechanic we have not seen since first edition, because in second edition, Mentor and Library and so on no longer gave XP discounts and just sped up the time it took to go from one level of understanding to another. The thing I really liked about this was it answered a question that came up a bunch in Revised of what happens to these groups where there are no mages practicing for some period of time. For instance, when we were talking about the Akashiyana, there are several houses within the Vajrapani that have no awakened members at any given time. How is the learning transferred from one generation to another when there may be a 50 or 100 or multi-century gap? And I think a really good answer is a grimoire, where there is this book or other thing that holds it. It may be a set of scrolls that are located within a sacred space, or a set of carvings or something that has that kind of information. And you need to practice what is depicted in it, but it gives a very concise way of containing that information. Now, the thing about this is the only part of the learning from a grimoire or Principiae are the actual words. The rest of it is the fact that you are investing yourself in the item, so that for it to be able to actually transfer that information, once again, you are investing that point of willpower in creating it. Once you have done so, you may make multiple copies, which raises some interesting questions. The grimoire is magically invested with the essence of its creator, and that helps pass on the information, which answers the question of, can you write down how to do magic and teach someone else that way? My answer has historically been more or less no, that magic is a highly embodied form of knowledge, and that there's really no way to teach someone magic. In the same way that with a tutor, it is relatively easy to teach someone most foreign languages, but to tell someone how to become a better high jumper is significantly more difficult, or to become a better surgeon, and it requires a lot of applied practice that needs to go outside that realm of discourse. And I think grimoires answer the question of, how does magic get transferred? And the answer is by magic itself and being invested with the essence of its creator.
When it comes to grimoires and Principiae, a couple of things stood out to me. First off, on page 65, there's a quote that I just can't get around. Because they are rooted so firmly in a particular tradition's paradigm, only mages of that tradition can understand and use them, end quote. So this seems to be a strong argument in favor of the idea of group paradigms. One of the interesting things about Revised Edition as a whole is the previous two editions of Mage said that, yes, paradigm is a thing in Mage, but we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. Revised Edition wanted to actually address it and specifically say, what is paradigm? How do we understand it? How does it work? But then it states that paradigm works on an individual basis. Every mage has their own paradigm. But then at other points in Revised Edition in the published books, it says, no, group paradigms is how it works. And it seems to argue both ways. And so mage fans are left to work that out on their own. And so this is yet another example in Revised Edition of the notion that there are group paradigms that should be applied rather than individual paradigms. And so, yeah, this is something all of us mage fans have to work out. We'll see if Mage 20th edition settles that argument more firmly. It's very interesting to see how in first edition we had mages writing books just for other mages, and when sleepers came across them, it was nonsense, and they thought it was written by crazy people, and it didn't affect them. And then we get into more second edition, especially late second edition, where there was this idea that any book on the topic of magic could be helpful to sorcerers and mages at the same time, and there seemed to be this idea that there were no mage-only books, there were just books on magic, and they could benefit everyone using magic, whether it's sphere magic or hedge magic or whatever. And so now here we have grimoires towards the end of Revised Edition. And so I just wanted to ask the question, have we come full circle? Are we back to mage-only books? It would seem that way, but perhaps there's a nuance I'm forgetting here. It says that if you raise your arete through the use of a grimoire, there is no seeking to accompany that increase in arete. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think just the nature of increasing a mage's arete permanently, not just for one scene dramatic effect, but to permanently increase their arete, I think seeking should go with that. It seems more appropriate for the concepts of mage, unless you have a game you're running with a lot of people and you're just pushing seekings aside in the interest of time. I totally understand that. It says that the primers, which are a special kind of grimoire that instead of increasing your arete or your sphere level, it takes you from arete 0 to 1. That's a primer. It says that primers only work on smart, flexible-minded sleepers. And I was reading that, I was thinking, this sounds like the conditions required for awakening from the early first edition for Mage, before we got into Brocato's emphasis that any person of any sort could awaken. So kind of interesting to see that. I'm not sure I agree with the idea of spending a point of permanent willpower to make a grimoire. And Terry hit the nail on the head. You spend that permanent point of grimoire, you're very personally invested in it, and you put it on the table and says, this is the book that has my essence within it. Now let's make 100 copies. Yeah. And somehow it works the same, and it doesn't pull 100 willpower out of me. It's like, how does this work? Does this work? Let's discuss this. So if we ever have a Mage Fan Roundtable, that might be one of those things that I just like to hash out with other people. Am I the only crazy person here? But this doesn't seem to fit for me. Now, this is not my favorite grimoire, but I noticed that in the Cloud Dance grimoire, it mentions that the Akashic and Wulong paradigms they're both going to benefit from this. It's like, the Akashic Brotherhood and the Wulong, they seem to have pretty darn different paradigms. So do they really just fold together? I'm not sure about that one. I might take issue with that. And finally, after reading through this whole section, just my own opinion, but I actually think that grimoires are a little too gimmicky for me. They don't seem to work for me overall. I'm not going to say you shouldn't use it in your game. I think they can be a lot of fun. I think it's a cool idea. It just seems too gimmicky to me. I think in my own games, I would probably fall back on the library background from first edition Mage, and I can agree with those Mage fans who might argue that that's probably a little too powerful, having a 2-point library that gives you an experience reduction anytime you raise any level of any sphere. 9 times 5, we're talking about probably 45 sphere levels. You have a 2-point library and you get a discount every single time for every one of those. Maybe that is stretching things too much. I'm open to that idea, but with adjustments, I would probably fall back on first edition library background rather than using Grimoires and Principiae from here. Finally, when we get down to the favorite, there's one called procedure.rand.enlight. And it basically says that it is a software manual or a software system created from the real-world programming language called Perl, P-E-R-L, all capital letters. And I thought that was just delightful because of my own background in software development. I have been in the room when sysops get together and get into heated discussions about whether they like Perl or Python. One thing to note for people who don't have a background in software development, the Perl language takes pride in the fact that you can solve any problem through any different method in Perl. Basically, there are infinite ways to address a problem, which makes Perl experts people who write code that is very personalized. You can have one guy write something in Perl and another Perl guy sits down and read it and is like, I would never do it like this. Why did he do it like this? And these days, the Python language is rising to prominence, and the Python prides itself on there being only one right way to do things. That is, when you're using the language and you've got to solve a problem, well, there's one way to do this, and once you learn it, you'll know that your software is going to jive well with everybody else's Python code. So just the idea that somebody wrote this grimoire in Perl, I just think it's so funny that another Perl user is going to sit down and start studying the grimoire. It's like they basically have to relearn Perl this guy's way in order to make sense of this manual, and I just thought that was a lot of fun.
I very much enjoyed the Cloud Dance of Eternal Vision and Joy because it showed you a grimoire that wasn't just a book that you read. It's a sequence of scrolls with exercises and so on that the characters need to go through. And I like the idea of characters stumbling across a grimoire and them not realizing that it's a grimoire. It could be a set of cave paintings or sacred weavings or prayers or mathematical equations or instructional videos or other things that they need to interface with. And the cool thing is, grimoires to me are a huge come together of Mage's idea that all paradigms work, in that if you do the thing and you try, you get to do the magic, assuming that you come to terms with the paradigm. And this makes them real in a very strong way. And if there were something I could scatter more of in the world of Mage, it would be Grimoires and Principies. I think they make things real interesting. Friend of the show, Charles Siegel, I think first brought up the theory that one of the reasons that technocrats are seemingly so capable in earlier editions is that they have much better access to research materials. That once someone figures out a way to do it, at a certain high level, you are expected to create a Principiae to pass on that information to others. So one of the things that is expected to be done of you before you can become a master or an archmaster, maybe in the technocracy, is that you write down your learning, and that makes it easier for everyone after you because of the rules whereby the first one costs you willpower, but you can distribute that to everyone. And I thought that was an interesting theory that one could use to say, hey, this is why seemingly you can have super competent technocrats running around within your game. That rounds out the magical item portion of the book, and the next one we get is Companions on the Path, Familiars. This is interesting in that we get a second piece of introductory fiction, as it were, and it follows the life of Mr. Mephistopheles, the familiar of our good friend Penny Dreadful. And it depicts two things that I think is interesting. One, the way in which Penny Dreadful provides quintessence for Mr. Mephistopheles to eat, as well as the Feast of Nettles, as the cat licks away the paradox that Penny had accumulated before suddenly needing to make a emergency break towards the end of it. It goes over the steps of getting a familiar, that there is some sort of calling out ceremony where you say, "Hey, I want a familiar! This is my opening rate!" And then there's a second part where a spirit goes, "Yeah, cool, that sounds good." And you need to make a body for it of some sort. It should be something familiar often, where if you want to have a dog spirit, you should probably have something that's kind of dog-like for it to be in. Other spirits specifically prefer something else. A spirit of air or water may enjoy being embodied in something else for a while, which I thought was a neat idea. You may need to fight over a carcass if, depending on if the spirit's like, "Nope, I need to be in a unicorn." And you're like, the problem with that is there's already a unicorn in every unicorn, and it's hard to come across spare unicorns. There is a bonding ritual of some sort where you are formally become the mage tied to a familiar. The mage only needs to be present for this part, which is how a mentor can kind of gift a familiar to someone. There are significant problems that are caused by the death of a familiar. Characters could suffer shock and lose the ability to act for a certain number of rounds. You lose quintessence. If you kill your own familiar, you will lose a dot of destiny and get a fate mark against you. I liked bringing back that destiny stuff that we haven't really played with since 1A seemingly. And it also mentions that if it dies, that you should get the background points back to get another familiar. And I like this because one of the ideas that is brought up in Chronicles of Darkness is that background points are kind of sacred, that once they are spent, assuming the character didn't do something remarkably stupid to lose a contact or an ally or something, they should be able to invest it in something else, and a narrative reason will be found why that changed. And I like that as an idea. You got familiar, you should keep it. And likewise, if a character invests in a talisman and does a reasonably good job of maintaining it and so on, if a storyteller finds it appropriate to take that item away from the character, they should get something else in replacement. It makes mention that exceptional familiars can create paradox if they do the impossible when they go out with a mage, and this is the forces of unbelief. And it also mentions that some bygones become familiars to avoid dying, and I would have loved more information on that. I think that's a really interesting option that says, there is a abominable snowman out there. It just happens to be this person's familiar, and the quintessence provided by them and the stability through the familiar bond is the only thing that prevents them from being shooed away by mortal belief. It also asks the question of, so who role plays the familiar? Should it be the storyteller or should it be the player? And it also makes a note that says, hey, storytellers have a hard job, which I appreciated seeing. And it says it should probably be a mix of the player and the storyteller. It gives a bunch of benefits for a familiar, that they have an arcane connection. They are always considered close for the purposes of correspondence. There is a bond of empathy between the two. A familiar is often capable of paradox absorption and consumption through what they refer to as the Feast of Nettles, the ability to slowly digest paradox over time. They can contain 5 points of paradox for each background point, which is, I think, a lot. So good on you. You can break that bond at any time and return the spirit to its service, as well as the fact that the spirit will likely have some sort of role within the umbral hierarchy, which may be useful. Additionally, if you have a spirit that is part of a brood, you may gain social or magical benefits when dealing with its broodmates. We then get a whole bunch of charms, which are the basic abilities that a familiar will have, that is fueled by essence, which is kind of their magical gas tank for the purposes of things. Adam, what did you think about the updated information on familiars, and did you have a favorite charm or two?
First off, for the opening fiction, I was rather disappointed to see the cat Mr. Mistopheles reduced to cat humor jokes. Mr. Mistopheles, as a minor familiar character, was introduced in Mage Fiction in 2nd edition. It originally belonged to, I believe it was Nefandus Jody Blake, and so Penny Dreadful sort of broke into the Nefandus's sanctum, met the cat, and the cat said, look, I'm not that loyal, I'll go with you. And so they traveled off together. And so there was this idea that Penny Dreadful may have gotten herself into more than she could handle, because Mr. Mistopheles is not necessarily a friend to all Nefandus. Nefondi, but still, this is a familiar that is willing, perfectly fine with working with Nefondi over a long period of time. And now it's with her, who is kind of the opposite of a Nefandus. And it's like there might be some sinister something going on with this familiar. And so I always thought that was pretty interesting. And so I read this fiction section, and it's basically cat jokes. And it's like, okay, I think this is a poor use of a potentially interesting character. Page 80, quote, "A spirit grows to reflect its body," end quote. And that's kind of backing up the idea from the opening fiction. You put an Umbrood into a cat body, it's going to become more and more like a typical cat. And I think, yeah, sometimes that can be the case. However, I think it's a lot more interesting when that is not the case. Have an Umbrood that is in a dog body and is very, very unlike a dog. I think even if that's just a NPC's familiar and the player's encountered, I think this can be very interesting role-playing there. So I like to play against type on that one. There's a lot of information on game systems for establishing the familiar bond. I just didn't think it was necessary. I just don't think that a character has to be this powerful before they spend some background points or experience points and get a familiar background. I just don't see how it's necessary. I don't even see how it's going to add a whole lot to my game to play out all these game roles in this long, serious process. I agree it is a very serious bond between an Umbrood spirit and a mage. And so there's going to be a scene to play that out. There's going to be some impact to that. I just don't feel like I need game systems to help me do this. I loved the creation sidebar on how to spend character generation points to make an NPC familiar. I thought that was great. That's actually something I'm definitely going to use in the future, because there is information in some other books about how to make basically a player character familiar or custos or bygone or something like that. And so that's like the higher level point values. This is a neat package for the lower level point values of this is a minor NPC tacked on to your player character. You get some use out of it, but let's not make it too powerful. So really appreciated that one. I enjoyed seeing the modern charms. In the list of roughly 46 charms, not counting the duplicates, there is a section for constructs, basically stuff that the mage builds and an Umbrood spirit goes into it, like a laptop or a clay golem or something. There are charms that they can use that have to do with modern technology and related things. And that was something that was not found in Bygone Bestiary, which was put out roughly for 2nd edition Mage. And so that makes this book very useful for me. That grouping of charms is something I would definitely use. And when it comes to two great charms, first off, Entrancement. This is basically the ability for a familiar to walk up to someone, sleeper or mage, look them in the eyes, and then suddenly they're in some sort of involuntary staring contest, and the victim can't look away. The victim is not attacked, not harmed, they just lose some time, and they don't notice what's going on around them for a certain period of time until they sort of break out of it. And I thought this is a very useful thing for mischief. I can just see the NPC mage who visits the player character's chantry or sanctum, and all of a sudden the character looks away and notices something is missing. It's like, hey, did you trick me? It's like, oh, no, my familiar's just really good looking. You were just admiring it, and, it's not my fault. What are you getting mad at me for? A lot of possibilities for pranks with that one. Also, the modern charm for constructs called Control Electrical Systems. This allows a familiar to use basically a spirit charm to cut the lights in a building for a short period of time before they come back on, or mess with the router, or mess with electronic security systems. Not in a major way. It's not a very powerful charm, but it can disrupt or modify slightly. And I thought that was very useful and very interesting to use in games. It can also give mystical mages a leg up when they're trying to stand up to technocrats. A familiar with ability like that might give them a chance. And also, it's just really, really useful to be able to go into a tense setting where maybe you're dealing with organized crime guys, and you can say, hey man, something big is going down. There's going to be a citywide blackout, and there's going to be all kinds of terrible things happening. You got to do what I say. And then the lights go out for a second, like, see, it's already starting. And the crook's like, oh, maybe this guy's right. So I just see a lot of role-playing potential for both of these charms.
I think of the ones that were listed, the ones that I think are useful. I like Swallow, which gives a familiar the ability to consume twice their body weight in material without harm, assuming that they can shove it into their mouth. And I love the idea of a familiar hamster. that just has the ability to absolutely shove massive objects into its tiny little hamster mouth. I don't know if you've ever had hamsters, but I think they're absolutely adorable, and the sheer volume of things that they will shove into their face while making direct eye contact with you, I think is great. And also the fact that the object is shunted off into the umbra somewhere, and it's like, question mark? I like the idea that characters can stumble upon the stomach contents of like a dragon just in the deep umbra somewhere, something like that, and not realizing that it's like a horizon realm of like dragon stomach. The other one that I like out of sheer practicality is quintessence grazing, which is the spirit has the ability to feed itself. You don't have to dedicate quintessence to it. It has to spend all of its time doing that, but this is super great for a familiar that is only spending some of its time with you, and that totally makes sense because maybe you're going to the digital web and you don't want to bring your tiger with you, or you don't have a way to digitize it, or you're going around in you have a spirit familiar that does not move around well in the material world, and you can just be like, go fend for yourself for a while. So that is a wildly practical one. The one I just have to call out for being remarkably stupid is the heat object one, where for a point of essence you can increase the temperature of something by 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which suggests that if you want to use your familiar to make a cup of coffee, that's going to take 6 or 7 points of essence, depending on how hot your tap water is. And that's just an obscene amount of essence to make a cup of coffee. So that may be my Rube Goldberg-esque least efficient way to make a cup of coffee via a familiar. And the fact that chill object is a separate charm that you need to get is just amazing to me. But it gives a bunch of interesting ones. If you're like, no, this section, as Adam mentioned, with 46 charms is not enough, I want more, I recommend Gods and Monsters, which was released for 20th Anniversary Edition, which has every possible charm you could want, I think, except for huge. There was an editing error and they forgot to actually, I think, include rules for that or something like that. I remember there's one thing they list there that did not have anything. I think it's interesting that for all of these familiars, they have an appearance of 0. I don't know what the author thinks appearance does at that point, where you're like, this is appearance 0? Like, do you just want to make it so people can't use their spider to seduce people or anything like that? But to me, like, if you have a dog familiar, you're like, oh, it's a really cute dog. Like, your dog should have 2 dots of appearance or something. You're like, oh, look at how cute that cat is. I get that. But just like the fact that if you're like, this is a horse with 0 dots of appearance, that is a fugly horse. I don't know. We get a little bit of information on how a familiar can raise their experience, and we get a familiar character sheet in the back, which I thought was actually kind of cool. I like that.
I'm just reminded of, they talked about splitting up the duty of handling the familiar in the game between storyteller and player, and I think that makes sense. When a group of player characters are in the field doing something, then yeah, the familiar is going to work with the mage, and so you just say to the player, control your own familiar. You have a very close bond between you. Of course, it's going to back you up, and it's not going to hurt you, so yeah, fine. But when it's not a tense scene, when things are more relaxed and you want to bring out the strangeness and otherworldliness of an umbrid spirit living in a dog, then you have the storyteller control the familiar, and it does weird things and says weird things that the player would not have thought of. And so that dynamic works very well for me, and it's nice that they called that out and help people to understand what they can do there.
So what'd you think about the book overall, Adam?
I think in the process of emphasizing special tasks, special materials, etc., you can shift the game's focus, perhaps without realizing it. Tracking down special materials can give story hooks and add spice, but if you're not careful, you get to the point where the magic is in the materials instead of in the mage. And so I think it's something you want to keep track of. Yes, wonders should be wondrous. They should be wonderful. They should be special. But at the same time, I just like the notion that magic, for those mages who are learning and becoming more aware of what's really going on in the world, they know that the magic is in the mage, not in the tools. I think in a subtle sense, Revised Edition pulls mages closer to being sorcerers with all of these requirements of needing special materials, special items, tons of skill rolls to do things. It's a subtle change, but I think it's worth calling out and paying attention to. The layout, the presentation, and organization of Wonders makes it much more approachable to me. The Mage Storyteller's Companion, thin volume towards the beginning of Revised Edition, had complete rules on Wonders, and a lot of useful stuff in there, but the way that it is presented, the way that it is laid out, it's all kind of mixed together. In fact, they not only try to mix different wonders into other types of wonders, break down the barriers between them, but they're also trying to pull in all these other different backgrounds and mix them with wonders. And so by the time I finished reading that section, I was genuinely irritated. If I'm going to prepare for a game, 6 months from now, and I just got to grab this, like, okay, what are we going to do with wonders? I am not going to pick up Mage Storyteller's Companion. I'm going to pick up Forged by Dragon's Fire, because they are all on each type of wonder is in a separate area. It is dealt with separately. How do you make it? What can you do with it? If I want to mix stuff together, I can figure that out on my own. I just want something that is well laid out, well presented, that I can grab it and refer to it as a storyteller, months from now when it's not in my memory so well. And so Forged by Dragon's Fire is going to be my go-to book when I want to get really specific with wonders. And as you did point out, there are areas where the rules are a little too strict on creation, or there's inconsistencies that don't make sense. Yeah, I agree. That's not nice for us storytellers to have to deal with later, but I feel confident that I can cope with it. If you're just going to give me a book where things are laid out, that I can quickly thumb to exactly what I want and nothing more, I'll work it out from there.
A lot of games with Magic have magic item creation systems of some sort, and I really feel like Mages still needs a bit of work. One of the problems with Mage is that you're constantly creating very powerful items that don't really go away quickly, so it becomes a question of costing, which is really hard to dial in, because something that's super powerful in one chronicle may not be in another, where if your characters never get into combat, then having your gun of vaporization +5, or as Adam mentioned earlier, the Chorister Rod of Disintegration +3, it is hard to come up with a convenient way to balance that in a campaign where that is used stylistically, where the Chorister does that to prove that violence is not the answer, versus in a game where that is a genuine Rod of Disintegration and it can single-handedly take down impressive antagonists seemingly trivially. Other games handle this in different ways, and Mage tries to handle it through costing. The companion episode that I hope to do to this is about Invisible Sun, which is a surrealist magic game that magical items are very common in the game, and the way it handles it is in two ways. One, with the idea of depletion, that it is very rare that a magic item will work forever. So you make them relatively easy to make, but they don't give you permanent benefit forever. The other is you have some sort of cap. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that when a character accumulates a new magic item, it needs to be attuned to them, and that they can only have a finite number of magical items attuned to them at any given time, that it's limited by Eurorite or something like that. So if you can only have 3 magic items, period, I think it's less of a concern. I think it also encourages characters swapping them around, which can be interesting. It gives you encouragement to deal with other mages. That's just my thought at my table. Everyone's mileage may vary. It would have been great to get like a 1-page rule summary, like in Beyond the Barriers and Infinite Tapestry. We had those 1-page how to get there pages, which were immensely useful. I think a similar thing here for this is how you charm, this is how you grimoire, and so on would have been useful. It raises a lot of questions about what Masters of Prime and Matter are doing with their time, if that's what's required for so much of it. A bunch of the effects listed in here have no mechanical precedent elsewhere in Mage. And one of the things from 2e I would have wanted to have grabbed was Spirit Ways introduced the idea of minor talismans, which were items that were basically foci that only worked for a single effect, but maybe allowed your character to do something that was a little bit outside their normal paradigm boundaries, or something that was difficult within their paradigm became a little bit easier. And those only required Prime 2. I was a fan of those. That's just me. So if you're like, hey, I want smaller, easier to do ones, look at Spirit Ways. And Spirit Ways also introduced the idea that magical items, that foci that are used repeatedly for a very specific magic effect can eventually become wonders in their own right. I really like that as an idea. Again, we don't have mechanics for that, so one would have to come up with that. The paradox handling in this seems really abusable if you have access to a node. Having access to a 4 or 5 point talisman that can suddenly consume 20 to 25 points of paradox allows for a very magically intense, high-power game at very low levels of magic. If that's the game you want, that's great. If not, that's a concern. So having a knob that you can adjust for that, I feel, would be useful. So I have a lot of feelings, but getting magical item systems to work is hard. It is a hard game system to figure out, and my sympathy certainly goes out to the author. It is something that in M20 is still not solved in my opinion. So hopefully we can do something to talk about other ways of doing that. Maybe we do this as an episode, maybe we do this as a Storyteller Vault. But as you can see, I have feelings about these items. But before I get too far into that, this book was great and giant and flavorful and had a bunch of really interesting options. It gave you a lot of cool things that you could scatter around the world. Even if you don't like the creation rules, it gave you a bunch of cool things that your characters can find. Every entry was dripping with flavor and paradigm, and it made Mage weird, and I always love when books do that. So don't let me rag on the tech too much, because magical item systems are hard. It was great. It was fun. It's just thumbing through it gave me ideas.
Yeah, it's interesting. Technomancer's toy box was basically, here is a collection of wonders, and that's what this book does. And with this book, it's like, this book is half collection of wonders and half creation rules. And so I guess in that sense, it's a little bit different. But yeah, the part of it that was a collection of wonders was wonderful. It was a lot of fun. Reading through these is like, oh, I've got adventure ideas, story hooks, etc. Just reading through these fun items. So that's a plus.
Adam went through the process of counting and found that there were 15 artifacts, 9 charms, 7 fetishes, 9 periapts, 22 talismans, 8 grimoires, and 46 familiar charms. So if that doesn't give you a reason to grab this and to also say, hey, Adam, thanks for counting those things, I don't know what will.
As we get towards the end of our episode, I wanted to share some story ideas, and here they are. I focused on the wonders for this and didn't worry so much about the familiars. Perhaps in the future I'll have some story ideas that focus just on familiars. But for now, number 1, the Mouth of Iduna is an old, influential group in the Verbena with connections to the Twisters of Fate. They maintain a presence in a remote part of Germany's Black Forest. Very few mages outside the Verbena have visited their place of power. The players encounter an owl with a message. A friend in the Verbena asks them to help with a problem in the Black Forest stronghold. A trusted adept of the Mouth of Iduna has been corrupted by the Nefandi and threatens to steal their ancient power. The players learn the Nefandi are after an immense grove of aged oak trees that serve as a periapt of incalculable reserves. The Verbena are upset that the players have uncovered their secret. Now the players must organize a defense with resentful, tight-lipped Verbena. Can they learn what they need to know and gain the elderly mage's confidence before the enemy attacks? Can they figure out how to use the grove without despoiling it? Wilderness skills and social skills will both be tested before battle ensues. Number 2. Markel the Magnanimous was an influential master of the Council of Nine, known for his ambitions. He went missing after the Avatar storm, but his work lives on. He created the Basin of Infinite Reflections, which is a 30-foot wide pool of water housed inside a chantry. This pool transfers quintessence to those who drink from it and gives visions of the future within chantry grounds and visions of what's currently happening farther away that could threaten the chantry or those staying there. When the players encounter trouble, they are grateful to hide out at the chantry and recuperate. They notice their hosts rely on the basin and are allowed to use it too. After discovering how useful the basin is, they begin to suspect something is wrong. They wonder why the basin is directing people to give aid and resources to Markel's former apprentice living nearby. Why does their safety depend on helping the chantry prepare for the visitation of an 8-winged angelic umbrood? Could Markel or his apprentice be pulling strings through the talisman he created? Can they convince the chantry dwellers? What if the basin turns on them? Number 3. Let it not be said that the Hermetics lack a sense of humor. Isabella of House Marinida created a cloak that one or more people could hide inside. While they sat inside what looked like a small tent, the person wearing the ordinary-looking cloak could pull quintessence from the people inside. Isabella used to hide inside the cloak's pocket realm, while her apprentices amazed people with their magical ability. The cloak has been an odd heirloom, changing hands many times over the years. One of the players receives it as a gift and is impressed with how easily they can smuggle friends into places. After some game sessions go by, one day the inside of the cloak is a large tent with a passageway leading away and down. Smoke is coming up from the passageway, and there's a smell of burning canvas. If the players investigate, they enter into a perplexing realm of connected tents and passageways that slope ever downward towards the problem. As luck would have it, once they embark on this quest, someone outside put on their cloak and is enjoying the newfound quintessence. Can the players solve their little problem while someone swipes their quintessence? Is the person wearing their cloak connected with the problem inside, or is it just one of those days? Well, those are adventure ideas for me. Hopefully that'll spark some ideas of your own. Terry, was there a quote for us on the way out?
Yes, but first I have a question. So Markel the Magnanimous, do you think that is a title people gave to him, or do you think he was one of those people that tried to establish their own nickname?
I'll bet he established that on his own.
Yeah, okay, that explains a lot. My favorite quote was on the Uranian Pleasure Manual, which was written by the son of Ether, Archmage Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, in 1879. The Uranian Pleasure Manual is a comprehensive book of metaphorical sexuality, profusely illustrated with a series of 360 lovingly rendered and highly detailed erotic lithographs. It is among the most amazing and coveted of grimoires ever produced. And I liked this because we get another Archmaster, and I am always a fan of that. The book can teach you a fifth dot, and since you can only grimoire something that is a level below your current level of mastery, he had to have had that sixth dot. And I also like that they pointed out that not only are these erotic lithographs well done, but they were also lovingly done. And when I come to a manual of pleasure, I want to know that the person who produced the lithographs therein did so out of a sense of joy and not begrudgingly. What my favorite rules text was for the read and write charm. It said, if it does not have opposable thumbs, it must use its mouth to hold a writing instrument, and its handwriting will be sloppy. If it has no fingers, it cannot type. Thank you. I'm glad we established that. And that's all for me. You want to take us out, Adam?
Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. So if you leave a review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches, and we would certainly appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes we prepare for you. This episode is thanks to executive producers Josh H., John Magnuson N., Jenna F., John H., Chris Sack, William M., Neil Patterson, Christopher, Buck Farmer, Anders S., Brendan, Dan Svensson, Jay Sunsern, Andrew E., William C., Isabel Castillo, Josh Golden, Michael Krettel, Freddie, Richard Bat Brewster, Bryce Perry, Andy, and Michael Parker. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening to us today. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
And if the Uranian Pleasure Manual describing how you want sex to work in your world doesn't exist, sacrifice that point of willpower and go create it. Bye.